With the release of X-Men 97 on Disney Plus that revives the classic animated series from the 90s, people started speculating online about the possibility of Spider-Man the Animated Series getting a revival in a similar fashion, with even the show's head writer and producer, John Semper Jr., stating that he would be open to the idea if Disney approached him to develop a new Spider-Man continuation. And if this were to happen, I'm sure that most fans would go crazy, since many of us grew up with the animated series as our very first exposure to Spider-Man, even before the excellent Raimi films, and the nostalgia for this show is huge. So today, I want to take a look back at this fantastic series and discuss all the questions that it left us with, like why was it cancelled? What would have happened if the animated series was continued? And we're gonna take a look at many other rejected ideas, early concept art, and other obscure production details shared by the show's writers in different interviews throughout the years. Production on the animated series started all the way back around 1993 and started airing on Fox Kids in 1994, being developed by Marvel Films Animation, a division of the production company New World Entertainment. And the decision to create a new Spider-Man cartoon around this time was heavily influenced by the fact that a Spider-Man live-action movie was being worked on by director James Cameron. Production company Carolco Pictures bought the rights to produce a Spider-Man movie back in 1990 and hired Cameron to work on the project. He actually wrote a script for the film back in 1991. So since production for this possible first live-action Spider-Man movie was currently active at the time, the Fox network actually made a 65-episode order for the series right out of the gate before production even started. Something that is really uncommon, since studios usually order only a season's worth of around 13 to 20-ish episodes whenever an animated show starts production. Besides this show originally meant to tie in with the unmade James Cameron film, the animated series was also created for basically the same reason as any other animated series was made back then, to sell toys, lots and lots of toys. In the early 90s, producer Avi Arad had acquired the license to sell Spider-Man toys from Marvel, and he wanted to create a toy line with a cartoon series alongside it to promote the merchandise. And so development on this new Spider-Man cartoon started in 1993 with heavy involvement from Avi Arad and Stan Lee originally. However, according to the show's staff, the series production had kind of a rocky start and were experiencing various difficulties. The writers couldn't agree on how to depict Spider-Man and his world. So early on, Stan Lee himself decided to call John Semper Jr., a TV writer with years of experience at that time, to come on the show as its head writer and producer. And they both had actually already met in the past, with John Semper meeting Stan Lee when he did a lecture in the same college that Semper was attending. And years later, Stan decided to bring him in as the producer and head writer of Spider-Man the Animated Series, serving as the person who made most of the main creative decisions on the show, with collaboration from other amazing writers like Mark Hoffmeyer, Stan Berkowitz, and others. But John Semper had a hand in writing most, if not all, episodes from the entire show. And Stan Lee himself also participated in the writer's room for season 1, but he later stopped contributing to the writing of the show. Another fun fact about Stan on the series is that he actually wanted to play J. Jonah Jameson on the show, but the studio decided to go with Ed Asner instead, which was a very smart decision in my opinion, since Ed Asner gave a fantastic performance as J. Jonah Jameson. Voice actor Christopher Daniel also gave a fantastic performance as Peter Parker and Spider-Man on the show, being able to be relatable, funny, and down to earth, while also being capable of doing very dramatic scenes when needed. However, he's another character that almost could have been played by someone else. Billy Campbell, the main actor of a really underrated 90s movie called The Rocketeer, almost played Spider-Man on the series. And producer John Semper actually really wanted Billy Campbell to get the role, but the studio ended up casting Christopher Daniel due to his great performance. And Semper didn't have any kind of say in the casting of the characters, given that his area was only writing, but even then, there were some creative decisions that were already made before he came onto the series as a producer. For example, the decision to make Peter college age was already made before Semper was hired. He didn't have much of a problem with that. But one creative decision he did have a problem with was introducing the Hobgoblin before the Green Goblin, which happened because Avi Arad was under the impression that Hobgoblin was more important than Green Goblin in Spider-Man lore. And this was probably aided by the fact that Green Goblin was currently dead at the time in the comics when the show was being developed. John Semper tried to correct this decision once he was brought in, but it was too late to stop the Hobgoblin from appearing first, since there were already toys being made for the character. So John Semper found a way to organically have Hobgoblin appear in Spider-Man's history before Green Goblin by having Norman Osborn be the one responsible for creating Hobgoblin's weapons and technology. While John Semper was the producer that focused on developing the writing of the series, Bob Richardson was the supervising producer in charge of the visual department of the series, and he did a fantastic job in my opinion. The series greatly adapted the look of Spider-Man comics, and it had beautiful detailed backgrounds of New York, with the artists of the show having even scoped and researched in New York City in order to draw it as authentically as possible. The series has a great sense of scale and architecture, and while the use of early CGI might be a little crude, it could have been worse, since originally, the show's staff had considered making all of the backgrounds completely made with CGI, but they realized that technology was simply too limited to do that at that time. Another limitation that the visual department had was a lack of time. The show's intro opening, for example, could have been really different. What you're seeing right now is the original unfinished planned intro for the series that they didn't end up using in the end. It was commissioned by Bob Richardson to animation company Mercury Zeitgeist Film Studios. They had storyboarded the entire thing, and it was comprised of original animation that was created just for this intro. However, Mercury Zeitgeist couldn't finish the opening on time, and since the series was close to premiering, the show's staff was obligated to create an entirely new opening by using finished clips from upcoming episodes and footage from toy commercials for the series. According to John Semper, the series had a really troubling start even after he was brought in as the new head writer, mainly because it felt like there was a clash of egos in the writer's room, and no one seemed to be on the same page. Every writer thought that they had the best perspective on how to portray Spider-Man, his stories, and his world, which really is a testament to how much Spider-Man meant to the show's writers. One specific difficult choice they were stuck on was who was going to be the first villain that Spider-Man faced for the first episode of the series, and the writers were actually considering adapting Venom as the show's first villain, since he was the most popular new character in the comics at that time. But it was actually Fox, the ones who rejected this idea and suggested that they slowly built up to adapting Venom. Their second choice was adapting Scorpion as the first villain, but ultimately, Semper decided that the Lizard would be the best choice as the villain for the first episode, since he was also one of the very first villains that Spider-Man faced in the comics, and the rest of the writers couldn't be opposed to the idea, since one of the main objectives that they had with the series was that they wanted to be as faithful and true to the spirit of the comics as possible. And so Semper brought in comic book writer Jerry Conway to write a draft for the Lizard storyline, with everyone agreeing to adapting it as the first episode. And both Venom and Scorpion were introduced in the very first season of the show, even though they weren't used for the first episode, with Venom even receiving a 3-part storyline for his introduction. This tendency to make multi-episode story arcs was something that Semper and the writing staff also received a lot of pushback from the network due to this, since it was very important to the staff to create arcs and expansive storylines that adapted the comics, but the network wanted the show to be more episodic and simple initially. However, as the series went on and they saw the success that their method of storytelling was receiving from fans and critics, the studio gradually became more trustful in their creative decisions. Another idea that they had considered early on was adapting Gwen Stacy for the show. However, the writers felt that if they would have introduced her, inevitably, they also would have adapted her death by the hands of Green Goblin, something that simply wasn't possible during the early 90s on animated shows, since broadcast standards and practices didn't allow to show on-screen explicit deaths for series intended for a young audience, so they opted not to adapt her in the end. And Semper chose to adapt Felicia Hardy as one of Peter Parker's early love interests, and he gave Felicia some of the characterization that he would have given to Gwen. And also, ultimately, Gwen Stacy did end up appearing as the wife of a Peter Parker from an alternate universe in the show's last story arc. On the topic of the series on not being able to depict on-screen deaths and censorship in general, there's a long-standing rumor about the show suffering from a lot of heavy censorship and restrictions by the network and the studio executives while they were working on the series. But John Semper has actually stated multiple times that this is largely untrue, even though the show did have some restrictions like not being able to show overly graphic violence with blood or having to depict laser guns instead of real firearms. The series overall had the same restrictions as any other 90s cartoon. They didn't receive too much pressure from the network, nor did they give back that many notes, censoring elements from scripts. Semper actually feels like these common restrictions that most animated series faced obligated the writers to be more creative. And just because they couldn't be too explicit doesn't mean that they didn't focus on deeper or heavier issues. For example, the episode Make-A-Wish was an adaptation of a comic called The Kid Who Collects Spider-Man, where Spider-Man visits a fan who's terminally ill with leukemia and only has a few weeks to live. The network also made an exception with guns by allowing to show a real gun in the episode Tombstone, and it was very important for Semper to adapt the story Turning Point from the comics, where the Green Goblin throws Gwen Stacy off a bridge, killing her, which was adapted in the show, but with Mary Jane falling from the bridge in place of Gwen, and instead of explicitly dying, she fell into a portal and we never saw her again, leaving Peter thinking that she had actually died, which in my opinion does have effectively the same emotional impact as Gwen Stacy literally dying, since Peter still had to deal with the consequences of losing MJ, so the show was able to make stories exploring the concept of death. They just had to be smart about it. Speaking of Mary Jane's disappearance, that was probably the unresolved plot line that shocked everyone the most, with many people still wondering to this day what happened to Mary Jane after this, since Green Goblin threw her off a bridge into a portal by the end of season 3, and in season 4, we get introduced to a new Mary Jane who ended up being a water clone created by Hydro Man. And while we never got to see what ended up happening to the real Mary Jane after being lost in the portal, John Semper has revealed in multiple interviews, such as his conversation with the podcast Amazing Spider Talk from 2016, where he talked about his plan as to how they would have shown what happened to Mary Jane if the series had gotten renewed for a season 6, where they would have explored the idea of Spider-Man continuing to visit different universes after Mysterio acquires the Time Dilation Accelerator, which is a device that can be used to open portals. And eventually, Spider-Man would travel to an alternate steampunk universe, where he would encounter Mary Jane in an alternate Victorian London, where fictional characters were real. Spidey would have actually teamed up with Sherlock Holmes in a steampunk version of Spider-Man. J. Jonah Jameson would also appear as an American vacationing in London, and they would have had to fight against Jack the Ripper, who would have been revealed to be Carnage. Spider-Man would later realize that the MJ and the Carnage in that steampunk universe were actually from his own original reality, displaced out of their own time and universe, and Spider-Man would have needed to get them all back to their own world. Overall, the show got really creative with how many ideas they executed as the seasons progressed. This was the first time that a TV show was made that actually attempted to faithfully adapt Spider-Man's comic book history, and on the contrary to the rumors of the series being overly restricted and censored, they actually had a lot of liberty. In fact, Semper and the writing staff weren't even restricted by Marvel, since they were protected by Avi Arad, and he allowed them a lot of creative freedom. That's why they were able to do so many type of stories, adapting most of Spider-Man's supporting casts villains, and even a number of heroes from all over the larger Marvel universe. That's why John Semper has stated in interviews that he sort of felt like a pre-Kevin Feige for Marvel Animation, since he had a lot of creative freedom in being able to cross over Spider-Man with other Marvel superheroes throughout its run. This is kind of funny, because the animated series has proven to be so impactful that the Marvel movies in following years actually took direct inspiration from the show. Venom's storyline and how he was introduced in the show served as a basis for Spider-Man 3, and its handling of the black suit, how it emotionally drains Peter and affects him in a negative way. They even adapted this scene from the cartoon where Spider-Man wakes up hanging upside down while using the black suit. Another connection with the movies is how when Blade was adapted for the big screen, he was depicted as being half human and half vampire, which is a concept that was first used in the animated series. And Semper has also mentioned that he wrote a Nick Fury template for an episode on the series, but it was turned down because Marvel was producing a Nick Fury TV series starring David Hasselhoff around that time. Another thing that Semper has also stated in interviews in the past is that he feels like the entire Spider-Verse concept was created by the animated series writing staff, since the first time we ever saw the concept of a multiverse team-up between different alternate Spider-Men was first seen in the finale of the animated series. And a story like this didn't happen in the comics until 2014 with the Spiderverse event, which was later used by Sony as a basis for their Spider-Verse franchise, and the animated series staff have never gotten recognition by neither Sony, Marvel, or Disney for their work in developing the entire Spider-Verse concept. Another thing that supports the idea that the Spider-Verse concept was conceived in the animated series is that one of the show's writers, Mark Hofmeyer, would later be hired by Activision in 2010 in order to write Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, a video game that lets you play as different Spider-Man from the multiverse, a concept that directly took inspiration from the animated series. Due to this, John Semper feels like Marvel should show some kind of recognition or credit for their contribution in developing the Spider-Verse concept, something that I personally agree with. The writers and artists have been disrespected by both DC and Marvel far too much, and there's too many examples of creators who contributed to the conception of comic book characters and concepts that didn't get any type of recognition or compensation. So considering that I honestly believe that the writing team of the animated series should really get the credit that they deserve. According to Semper, the entire multiverse team-up concept came about as an excuse to integrate the many different Spider-Man designs from the show's toy line, since a lot of different Spider-Man variants were created specifically to sell toys. A lot of them showed up in stores to be able to be purchased long before they appeared on the show, and he wanted to find an excuse to organically introduce them into the series. He also wanted to give a worthy, high-concept ending for the show. Madame Web also made a number of appearances throughout the series run, and she was meant to be training Spider-Man for a big event where the world would depend on him, which was meant to be this Spider-Verse finale. Ultimately, the show lasted for 5 seasons, but considering just how popular and successful the animated series ended up being, one has to wonder, why was the show cancelled in the end? Well, John Semper actually explained on a post from his Making of Spider-Man the Animated Series Facebook page that the show wasn't even technically cancelled. Fox had always originally ordered 65 episodes before the series started production, and the show ended up lasting exactly 65 episodes. So it pretty much felt like the series had run its natural course, and the chances of it getting revived for more episodes were pretty unlikely, because Marvel was bankrupt, and New World Entertainment, the company that actually produced the series, had also gotten out of business due to financial troubles, and there was no one to cover the production costs that Fox wouldn't be able to cover. So considering this precarious financial situation, it's understandable why the series wasn't renewed and it was simply allowed to end. Also, according to Semper, Fox seemingly hated Avi Arad, and in an older 2005 interview with World's Finest, he mentioned that there was some animosity between Arad and Fox executive Margaret Loesch. So all of this also probably didn't help with the show getting renewed. Season 5 and the show's finale were written and conceived already knowing that it would be the final season of the show. That's why the Spider-Verse finale kind of feels like a resolution of Peter's entire story arc. Semper has also explained in interviews that the scene of Spider-Man meeting with the real-life Stan Lee symbolically is meant to represent Spider-Man meeting his literal creator, and he explains that we're seeing the final stage of his hero's journey, which is a reference to Joseph Campbell's book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, that details how most myths and stories fall under a narrative archetype he coined the hero's journey, where a reluctant hero is resistant initially and doesn't want to answer the call for action, where the world is demanding that they embark on a mission larger than themselves, and his journey ends with a self-realization where they finally achieve a state of true happiness and fulfillment with their own lives, which is exactly how Spider-Man feels in the finale while reflecting with Stan Lee.
Now, after all I've been through, for once, I like my life. I like myself. And for the first time ever, I wouldn't want to change anything about me.
Spider-Man being able to honestly say that he's finally happy with his life is kind of deep and beautiful when you think about it. The biggest themes in his mythos, in my opinion, are responsibility and self-sacrifice. It's often said that every win for Spider-Man is a loss for Peter Parker. For example, Spidey might be able to defeat the villain of the week, but in order to do so, he made a sacrifice in his social life, like standing up his girlfriend and canceling a date that they had planned. Everything that affects Spider-Man's career positively also affects negatively on Peter's personal life. But Peter still chooses to continue being Spider-Man despite this for the greater good. Spider-Man is a physical manifestation of Peter's earnest sense of responsibility and the pressure he feels to use his powers for the good of humanity, even if it's gonna potentially ruin his personal life. It's him actively practicing altruism, and his best stories always showcased Peter's struggles. So I find it awesome that the animated series managed to give him a complete arc by showing us Peter going through horrible heartache and tragedy throughout the show's run, only for him to overcome everything and finally be able to feel truly happy with himself, not only as a person, but also as a hero by the end of his story. And technically, he got to meet God. He met his literal creator, which is kinda wild. Even though the Spider-Verse team-up was written as the ending of the series, while being almost sure that it would be the show's final season, the writers purposefully didn't want to resolve the plot thread of Mary Jane's disappearance in the off chance that the series got revived. And besides the Mary Jane story, there were a number of planned storylines that they had just in case Fox decided to renew the series for more episodes. As mentioned previously, Mysterio would have returned in Season 6, and he would have been in possession of the Time Dilation Accelerator. But not only that, Mysterio was also planned to be used in a team-up episode with him and Dormammu, and Spider-Man would have teamed up with Ghost Rider in order to stop the both of them. The show's writers had attempted to adapt this episode idea during the original show's run, but this was rejected by Fox because rival network UPN was actually developing a solo Ghost Rider cartoon at the time. And this is something that I've actually already talked about in a previous video, so you can check that out after this if you're interested in learning more. Another Marvel hero who almost appeared on the series was Hulk. He was also rejected at the time because UPN was airing an Incredible Hulk cartoon. This is the reason that Hulk was omitted when Secret Wars was adapted on Spider-Man, and he was replaced by the Lizard. By 1998, the Hulk animated series had already ended, so it might have been possible for Hulk to appear on a possible Season 6. Two other characters were also infamously prohibited to be used in the show. Sandman and Electro were both meant to be used in James Cameron's planned live-action Spider-Man film, and because of that, they were off-limits and couldn't be used in the animated series. Electro ended up appearing on Season 5 because by then, the James Cameron movie had stopped development and it simply wasn't gonna happen. But they never ended up adapting Sandman. They had actually used Hydro Man as a replacement on the show, since their powers are so similar. But it's safe to assume that if Season 6 would have happened, Sandman would have most likely finally appeared. The Beetle was another villain who almost appeared on the show. Even though we didn't see him on the cartoon, he did appear on issue 10 of the tie-in comic. He had an action figure on the show's toy line. He appeared on the show's trading cards, and even appeared on an episode of Iron Man's animated series. so it's very likely that he would have appeared on season 6 of Spider-Man as well. Miles Warren appeared on season 5 of the animated series, and was meant to return in season 6, debuting as his comic book persona, the Jackal. Richard Fisk, the Kingpin's son, was meant to return as his villain identity, the Rose, in a plot that would implicate Ned Leeds. The villains Jack-O-Lantern and Puma also would have appeared on a potential season 6, and Norman Osborn would have returned and taken back the Green Goblin identity from his son Harry. Classic Peter Parker love interest Betty Brant was also meant to appear on the animated series, and she even had a concept art made for her showing how she would have looked like, although her last name was spelled wrong for some reason. John Semper also revealed that he wanted to make an episode that was a homage to the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends 80s cartoon, with Spidey teaming up with Iceman and Firestar. So, given that the animated series has proven to be such a fantastic adaptation of Spider-Man that won multiple awards and is still beloved to this day, I personally wouldn't be too surprised if Disney does end up deciding on reviving this show, a possible Spider-Man 98 if you will. And by the way, at the time of me recording this, Disney has only released the first 2 episodes of X-Men 97, and I'm really enjoying the show so far. I love how they're evolving the story right after from where the original show finished. The writing is also taking advantage of the fact that it can be more mature and less restrictive than the original show without making it overly dark. The animation is also great, with fantastic action scenes, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where they take the story with everything that they're teasing. If you're currently watching the series, please let me know what you think about it in the comments. While I absolutely love the animated series and have a lot of nostalgia attached to it, I gotta admit that my personal favorite Spider-Man show is actually Spectacular Spider-Man. Both series are fantastic adaptations of the character, but I just think that Spectacular Spider-Man is my favorite interpretation of Spider-Man ever across all media. So I've always been most excited about the possibility of that show getting revived somehow, and Greg Weisman and the team being able to finally finish the story that they wanted to tell. The Spectacular Spider-Man writing staff had even planned a 65-episode run with direct-to-video movies continuing Peter's stories in college, something that they never got to do. The animated series, however, is much more likely to get revived, because after Disney's acquisition of Fox, it now fully owns the series, but the legal rights of Spectacular Spider-Man are actually shared between Disney and Sony, since the show was produced by Adelaide Productions, which is a subsidiary of Sony. Currently though, Disney has spent years producing a new animated series called Your Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, which was originally titled Spider-Man Freshman Year. And it's gonna be set in an alternate universe parallel to the MCU, where Peter Parker gets visited and helped by Norman Osborn rather than Tony Stark when he's a rookie hero. And it's gonna show his early adventures in high school with characters we haven't seen in the MCU yet. And I do like the show's art style and the few concept art we've seen of it so far. And I think that I can speak for all of us when I say that whatever Spider-Man show we may get in the future, whether it be Your Friendly Neighborhood, a revival of a cancelled show, or a completely fresh new take on Spider-Man we haven't seen yet, whatever the show may be, I just hope that it's good. That's all I want. A good Spider-Man show that has care, love, and respect for the characters' mythos and stories, just like the 90s animated series did for 5 fantastic seasons. But now I want to know from you guys, what do you think about Spider-Man the Animated Series? Is it your personal favorite Spider-Man show? Would you have liked to see the rejected ideas and characters we almost got to see in Season 6? And would you like to see a revival of the animated series? Or a revival of Spectacular Spider-Man? Or a revival of the MTV Spider-Man? Or a revival of Spider-Man 4? Or a revival of that Aunt May spin-off solo movie where she's a spy that Sony actually wanted to make for real? You know, cause that sounded like a good idea.